On August 12th, in the year 30 BC, the doors of the mausoleum where Cleopatra had sealed herself were forced open by Roman soldiers. The woman who had ruled Egypt for 22 years as the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty was now cornered inside a tomb she herself had ordered built. Outside, Octavian waited. The man who would soon become Emperor Augustus had chased Cleopatra across the Mediterranean, destroyed her fleet at Actium, conquered Alexandria, and driven Mark Antony to his death. Now, at last, the queen was within his grasp. What unfolded over the next 11 days, leading to Cleopatra's death on August 12th, would reveal a level of calculated cruelty that later Roman historians would work carefully to obscure. The official version tells of a dignified, almost poetic end, the queen choosing suicide by the bite of a sacred serpent. But the reality, preserved in private letters and first-hand accounts, is far darker. To understand Cleopatra's fate, we must first understand what she represented to Octavian. She was not simply a defeated enemy or a political rival. Cleopatra embodied everything Rome publicly claimed to despise: female power unmediated by men, Eastern wealth that threatened Roman ideals of austerity, and most dangerously of all, dynastic legitimacy that rivaled Octavian's own imperial ambitions. Mark Antony's alliance with Cleopatra and his recognition of their children as legitimate heirs to Eastern territories had created an intolerable precedent. Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a living challenge to Rome's authority and to Octavian's vision of a Roman world centered solely on himself. Killing her outright would not be enough. What she symbolized had to be destroyed, and that required something far more elaborate than a swift execution. When the Roman soldiers burst into the mausoleum, Cleopatra was accompanied only by her two most loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. According to Plutarch, who had access to sources close to the events, Cleopatra attempted to kill herself immediately, but was stopped. This detail is often romanticized, but the reality was far more brutal. Cleopatra was not gently restrained. She was physically overpowered. Her clothing was torn during the struggle, and she was dragged from the tomb in front of a small assembly of Roman officers, whom Octavian had deliberately summoned to witness her capture. This public humiliation was no accident. It was the opening act of a carefully staged spectacle meant to break not only the woman, but the myth surrounding her. Cleopatra was then taken back to her own chambers in the royal palace of Alexandria, now occupied by Octavian and his command staff. There, a series of encounters between the captive queen and her conqueror would reveal the raw mechanics of power behind the polished narratives of history. Octavian visited Cleopatra personally the day after her capture. At least 3 Roman officers were present, and fragments of their testimonies survive in later historical writings. This was not a meeting between equals, and it bore no resemblance to the dramatic negotiations portrayed in modern films. It was a harsh interrogation. Octavian laid out, with deliberate clarity, the only 2 paths available to her. The first option was total cooperation. Cleopatra would surrender all the royal treasures of Egypt, publicly renounce any claim her children had to power, and agree to be taken to Rome. There, she would be displayed in Octavian's triumph, paraded through the streets in chains as a living trophy of Roman victory. In exchange, Octavian promised that her life would be spared and that her surviving children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus, would not be executed. The second option was never stated outright, but it hung in every word. Refusal meant immediate death for Cleopatra and her children, the total extinction of the Ptolemaic line, and Egypt's reduction to a Roman province. Cleopatra asked for time to consider. Confident that he held absolute control, Octavian agreed. What followed over the next several days demonstrated both Cleopatra's strategic intelligence and the ruthless system that had closed around her. She began negotiating, not directly with Octavian, but with his subordinates, particularly Cornelius Gallus, the officer assigned to guard her. She offered bribes, she made promises, she attempted to create fractures within the Roman command structure. At the same time, she made requests that appeared harmless on the surface. Permission to visit Mark Antony's tomb to perform proper rites. Access to certain medicines to treat injuries sustained during her capture. The constant presence of her two attendants. Each request was calculated. Cleopatra was assembling the only form of control she still possessed, influence over the conditions of her own death. But Octavian was not easily deceived. His informants reported Cleopatra's bribery attempts, and more importantly, noted that she had begun eating very little. Roman physicians were sent to examine her. They reported signs consistent with suicidal intent. It was then that Octavian deployed the most cruel psychological weapon at his disposal. He ordered Cleopatra's 3 surviving children brought into her presence under guard. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, had already been executed in secret days earlier, though Cleopatra did not yet know it. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt at suicide would result in the immediate death of her children. For the first time in her life, Cleopatra found herself completely powerless. The woman who had navigated courts and empires through intelligence and persuasion was trapped by a threat she could neither outmaneuver nor endure. Her psychological state during these days was documented in disturbing detail by Olympus, her personal physician, whose account survives in fragments quoted by Plutarch and Cassius Dio. He described how Cleopatra alternated between carefully maintained composure during official visits and total emotional collapse when alone with her attendants. She inflicted wounds upon her own arms, hidden beneath long sleeves. She stopped attending to her appearance, something unheard of for a woman who had always used image as a political tool. Most disturbingly, she began experiencing hallucinations, speaking as though Mark Antony were present and holding imagined conversations with him. On August 5th, 6 days after her capture, Octavian visited Cleopatra again. This meeting was radically different from the first. Cleopatra's physical and mental deterioration was obvious. Her face bore signs of trauma and extreme stress. Over several hours of conversation, she appeared to surrender. She agreed to full cooperation, revealing the locations of hidden treasures and providing detailed information about Egypt's administration that would aid Roman control. Satisfied, Octavian relaxed the guard around her. It was a fatal mistake. Cleopatra had not capitulated. She had moved into the final phase of a desperate plan. What exactly she intended remains debated, but evidence suggests she was not merely arranging her suicide. She was attempting to ensure that her death would occur on her own terms, and crucially, that it could not be exploited by Octavian in the triumph he so desperately desired. The Roman triumph was not just a military celebration. It was a political ritual, a performance of domination in which defeated enemies were displayed before the people of Rome. To parade Cleopatra alive in chains would have been the ultimate symbolic conquest of the East. Cleopatra was determined to deny him that victory, but any obvious suicide attempt would doom her children. She needed a death that would appear unavoidable, or at least beyond the ability of her guards to prevent. And so, she waited. In the final days before her death, Cleopatra appeared to change. On August 10th and 11th, Witnesses noted a visible improvement in her behavior. She began eating again. She spoke more freely with her guards. She even discussed practical arrangements for her upcoming journey to Rome. To the Roman officers watching her, it looked like surrender. To Octavian, it appeared that her spirit had finally been broken. This transformation was deliberate. Cleopatra was performing one last role, drawing on the same skills she had used throughout her life, not to preserve her power, but to manage the conditions of her end. By convincing her captors that she had accepted her fate, she created the narrow opening she needed to act without placing her children in immediate danger. On the morning of August 12th, Cleopatra made her final request. She asked Octavian for permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony one last time before departing for Rome. She framed it as a farewell, a final act of mourning before submitting fully to Roman authority. Octavian, convinced that she no longer posed a threat and confident in his control, granted the request. What happened that afternoon inside Antony's tomb has never been fully clarified. The version that survived into popular memory speaks of a serpent hidden in a basket of figs, of a queen choosing a poetic death by the bite of the asp. But this story, repeated for centuries, collapses under scrutiny. First, snake venom, even from venomous species known in Egypt, rarely kills as quickly or as peacefully as the legend claims. Death is usually prolonged, painful, and unpredictable. Second, Cleopatra was known to have studied toxicology extensively, a fact attested by multiple ancient sources. She had experimented with poisons and understood their effects in detail. A woman with that knowledge would not entrust her death to an uncontrolled animal. Most telling of all is what the Roman guards found when they entered her chambers. Cleopatra was dead. So were her two attendants, Iris and Charmian. The idea that a single snake could kill 3 adult women in a short span of time strains credibility to the point of fantasy. Modern toxicological analysis, combined with a re-examination of ancient accounts, suggests a far more plausible explanation. Cleopatra likely used a fast-acting poison, possibly a prepared mixture involving concentrated opium, hemlock, or another potent plant-based toxin. The marks on her arm, later described as snake bites, could just as easily have been pre-existing self-inflicted wounds or even injection points. Introducing poison directly into the bloodstream would explain the rapid, relatively calm deaths of all 3 women. The serpent story may not have been invented by Roman propagandists alone. It is possible that Cleopatra herself encouraged it. A death associated with a sacred Egyptian symbol was more dignified, more mythic, than a straightforward poisoning. It allowed her final act to retain a sense of royal and cultural meaning. But the most disturbing aspect of Cleopatra's death is not how she died. It is what followed. When the guards discovered the bodies, Octavian was informed immediately. His reaction, according to multiple sources, was one of intense rage. Not because he mourned Cleopatra, but because she had robbed him of the political prize he desired most. Without Cleopatra alive, the triumph he had planned lost its centerpiece. The symbolic conquest of the East was incomplete. Octavian ordered his best physicians to attempt to revive her. When that failed, he briefly considered displaying her embalmed body in the triumph instead. Advisors ultimately persuaded him that this would cross even Roman standards of sacrilege. Denied the spectacle he wanted, Octavian turned to retaliation. He allowed Cleopatra to be buried with royal honors beside Mark Antony, as she had requested in a final letter. But this concession was accompanied by a systematic campaign to erase her legacy. Statues of Cleopatra throughout Alexandria were torn down. Her name was chiseled from public inscriptions. Temples and monuments associated with her reign were altered or destroyed. More enduring than physical destruction was the campaign of narrative control. Octavian and the historians who followed his lead reshaped Cleopatra's image for generations to come. She was no longer remembered as a capable ruler or skilled political strategist. Instead, she became a caricature, a foreign seductress, a manipulative woman whose beauty had corrupted noble Roman men. This version of Cleopatra served a clear purpose. It justified Rome's conquest of Egypt. It framed Octavian's victory as a moral necessity, and it reinforced deeply rooted Roman anxieties about female autonomy and Eastern power. The fate of Cleopatra's children exposes the final hypocrisy of Octavian's promises. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from the historical record shortly after their mother's death. Historians debate whether they were quietly executed, exiled, or died of illness while in Roman custody. Their disappearance itself speaks volumes. Only Cleopatra Selene survived, and only because Octavian found political value in her. She was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a client king installed by Rome. Through this marriage, the last living heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty was transformed into an instrument of Roman foreign policy. Even mercy, when it came, was a form of control. The story that survives of Cleopatra's final days is not an objective record. It is a narrative carefully shaped by the victors. The image of a queen dying gracefully by a sacred serpent serves multiple ideological goals. It romanticizes the death of an enemy, making her less threatening to history. It obscures the realities of captivity, psychological torment, and coercion. And it allows Rome to present itself as magnanimous, as though Cleopatra were granted the dignity of choosing her end. The less familiar accounts tell a far harsher story. During the last 11 days of her life, Cleopatra was systematically stripped of everything that had defined her existence. Her political power was gone. Her autonomy was eliminated. Her dignity was eroded through public humiliation and constant surveillance. She was subjected to emotional blackmail through threats against her children. Even her body became a site of control, watched, examined, and regulated by her captors. The fact that she managed, in the end, to reclaim a fragment of agency is often presented as a moral victory. But this interpretation ignores the context. Cleopatra's choice was not between life and death. It was between dying on her own terms or being paraded alive through Rome as a spectacle of conquest. This is not a story of triumph. It is a case study in how absolute power operates, how it reduces even the deaths of its enemies into political theater. Cleopatra's legacy was shaped as much by what came after her death as by her actions in life. For centuries, she was viewed almost entirely through Roman eyes. The exotic temptress, the dangerous woman whose allure undermined rational Roman virtue. This portrayal was never accidental. It reinforced Roman cultural superiority, justified imperial expansion, and warned